right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session. Thank you for being here. My name is Julie Edelman, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at DoubleVerify. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are pleased to be speaking today about the important topic of sustainability. We've brought together some amazing industry leaders for a lively discussion, and we welcome your input and feedback along the way. Just for a little bit of housekeeping, we will be recording this session for future reference. For the Q&A, we absolutely want you to be able to participate. We are pleased to take questions. Just please submit them via the Q&A feature in Zoom and not the chat. Our team will either answer them directly in the Q&A or we will address them during our Q&A session that will probably start around 10:40 today. I'd like to begin by welcoming our esteemed panelists. We have an amazing group of people here with us today. We've got Brian O'Kelly, the founder of Scope3, a company leading the decarbonization of the media and advertising industry. Brian is a respected entrepreneur and an executive with a track record of building companies that have defined and led multi-billion-dollar categories. Brian was the co-founder and CEO of AppNexus through its sale to AT&T in 2018. He co-founded Waybridge, a supply chain technology company, and served as the CTO of Right Media through its successful acquisition by Yahoo. Brian is actually credited with the invention of programmatic advertising and the online ad exchange. We also have Kara Pratt, the SVP of Kroger Precision Marketing. She is a recognized pioneer in the retail media industry. Kara oversees strategy, media product development, sales, and operations of in-store and off-site media advertising for Kroger's retail media business. She was instrumental in the creation of Kroger Precision Marketing, which closes the loop between media exposure and store sales. Kara has been at Kroger Precision Marketing for almost 6 years after stints with both IRI and Nielsen, and a previous tenure at dunnhumby for 12 years. Our final panelist is Ollie Joyce, the Global Chief Transformation Officer of Mindshare. Ollie worked with some of the world's most progressive and prestigious brands, Nike, Volvo, and Dyson, amongst many others. He is now working with clients to create future-fit strategies and operations. Central to his role is sustainability, the single biggest transformation of the next 10 years. So as part of this role, he has co-authored Calculating a Cleaner Future, which is GroupM's open source framework for media decarbonization. DV's vision has been consistent since our inception over 10 years ago, to make the digital advertising ecosystem stronger, safer, and more secure. We are in the business of trust, and by ensuring that digital ad transactions are transparent and performing, we build critical confidence between buyers and sellers of media. This paves the way for continued exponential growth of the digital advertising sector. For us to achieve this vision, our team is focused on executing our mission, which is to develop independent media quality and performance solutions that drive better outcomes for advertisers, for you. This mission supports our vision of a stronger, safer, and more secure ecosystem, and very importantly, creates a better return on investments for DV clients. We believe it is very important to remain an independent third-party solution, and we do not buy or sell any media. When we are successful in our mission, we amplify our customers' success also. The way a company expresses its values has become just as important as the product it sells. Brand values impact reputation, consumer buying decisions, loyalty, and very importantly, advocacy. Advertising is one major way that a brand manifests its values. An important topic in the spotlight for all of us in the industry right now is the topic of sustainability, which is why we're all here today. I'd like to share DoubleVerify's corporate values to provide some critical context for the rest of this webinar. At DoubleVerify, we are committed to delivering an exceptional people experience and fostering an equitable, intentionally inclusive culture where differences are celebrated, marginalized voices are heard, and each employee is empowered by a sense of belonging. Our 4 core values are passion, accountability, collaboration, and trailblazing. We have blazed a trail in the area of sustainability by collaborating with Scope3, with a variety of industry bodies, and our clients to start developing tools that will be easy and meaningful in reducing their carbon emissions. We want to be accountable, and we want to hold others accountable for making a measurable difference. For starters, I'd like to highlight the significance of digital advertising on the environment, and we'll give some perspective from one of our partners that's joining us today, Scope 3 and Brian. As you see here, 1 million digital ad impressions equates to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions. This is crazy. It's the equivalent to flying round trip from Boston to London, driving a gas-powered car from New York to Vegas. Anybody can join me doing that. Or charging 121,643 smartphones. Brian, I love the preciseness of your data. You can tell Scope 3 is a data company. Let's now look at the basics of how digital advertising industry supply chain produces a meaningful carbon input and acknowledge that there are emissions throughout the life cycle of a digital ad. It's really only with this understanding of the full impact that we will be able to start collectively taking responsibility and addressing the issues. When advertising is created, there are emissions from agency overheads and the production process. When media is produced, there are emissions from content production, such as equipment use, transportation, catering, and post-production. When an ad is targeted, there are emissions from servers and cloud computing, electricity use, and the overhead of all of the vendors. When an ad plus media is consumed, there are emissions from a user's device, from data transmission, and the distribution as it relates to any content. And finally, when a product is purchased, there are emissions from manufacturing, distribution, use, and disposal of that advertised product. Now, we know that at a high level, the majority of consumers show a preference to companies that share their beliefs and values, with that figure being as high as 63%, according to recent Accenture research. There are a variety of values and factors that influence a consumer's decision to purchase from a company, and it's not surprising that at the very top, it's the treatment of customers and employees. According to eMarketer, the environmental practices of a company is the next highest ranking factor that influences purchase decision, with nearly 80% of global consumers calling out environmental practices as a fundamental influencing factor. So we've just seen how important the environmental practices are for consumers, but what about the expectations of brands? According to Microsoft Dentsu research, 84% of global consumers are more likely to purchase from a company that practices sustainable advertising. 77% said that in 5 years, they will only want to purchase from brands who have implemented sustainable and green advertising. Notably, both of these pieces of insight are specifically about the sustainability of a company's advertising and not just a company's green sustainable general efforts. This was really surprising to me when we were prepping for this webinar. Consumers have understood that digital advertising produces a meaningful carbon input, and they are looking to brands to implement change. Brands that neglect sustainability in advertising will not only contribute to damaging our climate further, but they will alienate, frustrate, and ultimately lose consumers. Now, sustainability in advertising, it's not a new topic, and our industry has already started responding and acting, with today's webinar being part of that ongoing discussion. We are talking with each and every holdco on this critical topic, including Group M's Mindshare, who is with us today. And literally each and every day, one of our clients is asking us for help and perspective on this topic. The conversation has shifted from looking at what the environmental impact of digital advertising is to addressing how we fix the issues, and we are really excited to hear from our experts today. So with all of this context in mind, I'd like to kick off our discussion by thanking our panelists again. They are very busy. They have very important day jobs, so huge thanks again for being with us. Reintroducing Brian O'Kelly, Kara Pratt, and Ollie Joyce. So I'm going to start with a general question that's going to be for all of our panelists. Ollie, I think we'll start with you, but I would love for everyone to answer this question. So for global brands and global agencies, having a macro level helicopter view of a brand or a company's carbon input across all of the countries in the world is something that we really believe is critically important. In order to compare apples to apples, it's really important for a brand to leverage consistent measurement of carbon emissions on a global basis. So how do you see this shaping up currently? Are brands and agencies aligned across different countries and across their different business units? Or do you still see a lot of cases where different teams are trying to identify their own strategies and their own actions to measure and think about sustainability in advertising? So Ollie, I am going to turn it over to you first.
Right, thanks, Julie. I think to answer that, I kind of wind the clock back 18 months when WPP did an assessment of our emissions supply chain. And what we found is that 55% of our total emissions came from the media supply chain. So if you're serious about decarbonisation, then you need to be serious about addressing media as part of that. We made a Science-Based Target Initiative's commitment to reduce those Scope 3 emissions in media by 50% by 2030. And at the time, to be honest, we didn't know how we were going to do that. But the first thing we did was we looked around the market and see what was available, including some of the own work that was done across our network. And I think we found three things. Firstly, there was a big focus on kind of rough, broad estimates and offsetting, but there was very little that was to do with kind of accuracy and reduction. We found real inconsistency in terms of the methodologies that were being used. I think Brian appeared on a panel in Paris where two calculators produced estimates that were different by a factor of 5, which is really problematic if you want to generate trust in the work you're doing. And I think because of those two factors, there was a lot of positive intent and a lot of good work, but there was really limited progress on reduction. So having kind of found that, back to your question, there was no alignment across the industry or across markets. We spent 9 months defining a framework which had clear boundaries that defined the activities within those boundaries and the data that would be required to calculate emissions from those activity. So we had a consistent view internally, but we then open sourced that. We made it available to everybody because we understood that we drive reductions much faster if there was a common market approach. And we're not there yet. But I do think over the last 6 months, encouraged by trade bodies, encouraged by AdNet Zero, we are seeing a much greater understanding that this should be a pre-competitive issue because a common approach and a common framework will really benefit all and really accelerate progress in this area.
Thanks, Ollie. Brian, do you want to take it from here? And we have the panelists on full screen, Brian. It just is showing up a little bit differently on your screen. I just wanted to make sure you knew that, but would love for you to answer this question.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I'd echo Ollie that a year ago, this was pretty new. And I don't think everyone had thought through the full consequences of that value chain. And you showed the slide with this sort of curvy, media production, distribution, ad selection, and then the actual impression happens. What I think GroupM did incredibly well was help us map the advertising supply chain to the greenhouse gas protocol so that when we're thinking about the manufacture of raw materials, copper or iron ore, that's very similar in our world to the production of media and the way that we do creative production. And so I think that was the first step, was we understand that if you're a sustainability executive, if you're working at a big company that's doing sustainability reporting, we needed a common language that we could use across all the different supply chains that a major corporation has. So whether it's an industrial supply chain or a services supply chain, we're using the same terminology. And then that value chain can be calculated using boundaries that are consistent across an organization. And you may hear a lot of talk about, do we include or how do we calculate Scope 3? It's like lowercase Scope 3, not my company's name. And that's because that means supply chain emissions or value chain emissions. And of course, companies are global. Companies have, in some cases, millions of suppliers. Those are part of the products that we ship and sell. And so in the same way, in advertising, we have to understand the full value chain. And so, Ollie, your point, when I was speaking in France, the difference was that we were calculating from media through ad tech to the creative, and the other company was only calculating the creative. And so from our perspective, the creative is a relatively small part. It's the end of that supply chain. But if we calculate the whole supply chain and they calculate a part of it, we're just not doing apples to apples. And so that to me is where I think we've come a long way in the past year. I haven't heard anyone argue that we should not include the entire value chain. There are still some questions about how to do that. There's different methodologies, there's different things, but I think that's the progress we've gotten to. So if you're a global brand, you may have different agencies in different markets. We can calculate consistently in all those markets. And I do believe that this will be consistent with the impending EU regulations that require companies to report their full scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The US may do the same. A lot of big companies have their own internal rules. And so I think we're in a pretty good place that we're going to be able to calculate this. And then using partners like DoubleVerify, who've actually incorporated this into the tools that agencies and brands use every day, this is going to get easier and easier. So it's not a big involved process. It's something that's just part of everyday reporting. So I think that's been a huge amount of progress in the past year.
Great, Brian. I think this is a really good transition, and then Kara will go into Kroger. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about Scope 3, why you founded Scope 3 in the first place, and some of the recent learnings over the last year?
Yeah, I didn't really set out to start a sustainability company in the advertising space. I just got really obsessed with supply chains. And you mentioned Weybridge, the company I started in the space, metals, copper, and aluminum from where they were mined and smelted, for instance, in Chile, onto boats through the Panama Canal to Florida, where they'd get put on a train or a truck and shipped off to a factory. And that process of understanding complex supply chains, I couldn't help myself because I'm, deeply embedded in the advertising world. I started to wonder, how are brands making these incredibly complicated calculations for advertising? And I, on the back of an envelope, I sketched out what that number was, and I was just shocked. And I think a lot of people are shocked at the carbon footprint of digital advertising. It's the kind of thing where the number was so big, I just kept building more and more complex spreadsheets and then data science models. I'm like, I got to be wrong. Like, this can't be the right number. But when I realized it was, one of the first people I talked to was Ali. I said, GroupM has made this major commitment. You see how big this number is. How are you doing this measurement on a per publisher basis? How do you know the difference between the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal? Like, that's a huge amount of effort. I think I can calculate this without having to do, a 3 or 4 year process of sending surveys to these companies. Because don't forget, those companies are still figuring out their own numbers. And it was kind of like the company created itself. Like, we needed an industry standard for this. We needed ways to get this data into the hands up and down the supply chain. There's so many tools, so many companies, global complexity. I just felt like this company was going to exist. And if I could use my experience and this incredible team of people that I could assemble and world-class investors who would put some money behind it, we could go so much faster than anybody else that I kind of felt compelled. Like, this company needed to exist so that we could do this rapid decarbonization that I think all of us are committed to.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Kara, when would you say that the topic of sustainability, and specifically sustainable advertising and sustainable media, started to begin being talked about more at Kroger? Is that like recently, like the last 6 months, the last year? How long have you been talking about it, and what have been the recent discussions?
Yeah, good morning, Jules. Really appreciate being here and sharing highlights and conversations on this really critically important topic. Love your question, and I'll certainly speak to sustainable advertising in a moment, but I want to start with just a short reflection on Kroger's overall ESG strategy and how it's focused on how we can achieve lasting positive change through the shared value framework that benefits people, our planet, and of course, creates, importantly, a more resilient system for the future. If you don't do that, the sustainability will wane too quickly. So the centerpiece of Kroger's ESG strategy is our Zero Hunger, Zero Waste social and environmental impact plan. We introduced that in 2017, and that was introduced to address the fundamental absurdity in our food system. And Kroger is America's #1 grocer. So it was really addressing this absurdity in our food system, where people throw away 35% of all food produced in the US, yet 1 out of every 8 Americans struggle with hunger. To feed a growing global population, the world needs more responsible and sustainable food production and waste practices at scale. And again, as the #1 retailer in the US, we know that we have a unique responsibility to lead change. So zero food waste then extends into zero operational waste, offering more sustainable packaging, optimizing water use. And across all of our operations, Kroger's current target is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030 from a 2018 baseline that we have. So this then extends into the global supply chain for responsible sourcing, commitment to respecting human rights. So you can see that sustainability is just frankly woven into the fabric and culture of who Kroger is. But the sustainability of digital media, to your specific question, the reality is it's a newer topic for us, certainly a newer topic for us, but it fits into our broader vision. And it's only natural for us to assess the digital supply chain with the same level of intensity and rigor as we're applying to our physical supply chain over the years. So we really look forward to leaning in, learning, driving change, and influencing the future across media, just as we're doing across the end-to-end ESG practices of the Kroger company.
Awesome. Kara, as a fellow Cincinnatian, it has been amazing to see Kroger's success and Kroger Precision Marketing's success with you really leading a lot of that strategy. It's been super inspirational.
Thanks,
So,
Jules.
You're welcome. Ollie and Brian, for those advertisers who are new to measuring their carbon emissions, which is probably almost every advertiser or every retailer out there, what would you say are some good first steps to think through when they're defining a strategy for sustainable advertising? And Ollie, I'll start with you on that. So good first steps.
Yeah, we talk about 4 steps, and they might sound obvious, but first is set a target, make it ambitious. It's a huge catalyst to getting going on things. We've said 50% reduction by 2030. That sounds a lot now, but if you set yourself a goal of reducing 10% a year for 5 years, that is definitely achievable from what we've seen early doors. So set that target. Once you set that target, agree the measurement framework. We have a measurement framework that people can look at, create your own, although I think standardization is important, but you've got that goal, work out how you're going to do it. I think the third step is identifying what's the immediate opportunity versus what will take longer. Programmatic, and Brian will speak more to this, there is lots of low-hanging fruit. There is lots of poor behavior that can be quickly addressed, and that we have the data and the technology to address that quickly. So programmatic might be where you start. There are other channels, we're looking across all channels, not just digital media, where data is a challenge. So it might be a 2-3 year journey to get there, but we will get there. But I think understanding what's fast moving and what's slow moving is useful. And then I think lastly, be prepared to move dollars. Money is what changes behavior. The threat of losing money is what encourages people to do the right thing and do it quicker than otherwise. And already within the programmatic space, we've seen that actually moving money from sites that have low emissions per impression, moving money into those has the desired effect. And, Brian can talk to this, but changes can be made very, very quickly. So I think that those are the 4 steps, and where people are putting those in place and getting on with it, we're starting to make progress, and we will start to make progress towards that long-term goal.
Ollie, as a former P&Ger and a former Googler, where moving money absolutely makes a difference, I think that is a really important, bold, and courageous step that needs to happen. That's really where the rubber meets the road. So thank you for saying that. Appreciate it. Brian, your perspective on this question?
Yeah, I'll focus on the reduction aspect of this. So before you set your target, I think it's useful to know what the opportunity is. So, Kara, you mentioned that Kroger, this is a long process for a real world business with complex supply chains. I mean, really going to actual farms and changing behaviors is not an overnight fix. What you might not know is that between 2 websites, just as an example, 2 news publishers, you might actually see 100 times difference in the carbon footprint of those 2 publishers. And so when we talk about moving money from the bad one to the good one, you could actually reduce your footprint dramatically. And one thing we've also seen is that there's not a huge performance difference. And in fact, those big complex supply chains we're talking about is because people are auctioning ads to too many intermediaries. It's auctions of auctions of auctions of auctions. Every one of those hops is taking money out of the buy and introduces risk. So all the transparency issues that the ANA and ISBA and others have talked about are because there's too many intermediaries. So we're basically taking this complex supply chain and squishing it down to a very direct relationship between an advertiser and a publisher. And that's actually really good for performance, and it lowers brand risk. It increases working media. We can actually see performance increase when we do that. So we're talking about, just as a recent example with another Group M agency, we saw removing the 7% of the worst carbon sites from a plan reduced carbon by, I think, 29 or 30%. And that happened in a week. And that's a huge, huge change. And because programmatic is so high, that has a ripple effect on the rest of the media plan. The publishers that were impacted, those 7%, Ollie's right. One specific one, Group M in the UK reached out and said, hey, we're taking you off our inclusion list because your carbon's too high. And within, I think, 2 days, they cut their carbon footprint by a quarter and actually reached out to us for some advice about how to go even further. And those changes, that drop of a quarter, didn't just affect that one advertiser, that affected the whole market. So we're actually cleaning up the entire supply chain. So your change in behavior benefits everyone. And that's also why this is pre-competitive, because a cleaner supply chain benefits everyone equally. So there's a really awesome like network effect or ripple effect of this, that as companies start to make carbon or sustainability a part of their procurement decisions, everyone's going to change their behavior throughout the entire ecosystem.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. Kara, so could you talk just a little bit more about how you see sustainability playing a role in your media strategy and your media planning? And specifically at Kroger, what are some of the examples of questions or themes that you pay attention to when you're specifically talking about sustainable media?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jules, and a great bridge from some of the highlights that Brian shared. I love the speed to action that can happen. Knowledge is power, right? Giving people an understanding about the impact of practices today to influence buying behavior, activation behavior, planning behavior. It's just inherent to drive better returns and better sustainable impact. From a planning standpoint and a strategy standpoint, we believe it has to be inherently woven in to that phase, because if we don't, the struggle will be real to make it meaningful and sustainable. And from an industry perspective, it is fractured. It's a very fractured environment right now. We have to find ways of reducing those redundancies, lowering these digital advertising emissions without asking buyers to go backwards to direct agreements to each individual publisher. Because we know that we also need to scale businesses in productive and performant ways too. So that means that technology is still going to be crucial. We just have to be smarter about how we're leveraging technology and how we're feeding real-time information and the right signals into the buying behaviors that exist for investment teams. We have to be strategic on the integrations with helping publishers and commerce media companies like Kroger Precision Marketing meet buyers where they are, whether that's around private marketplaces, right? Making it easier for buyers to activate campaigns across the web with more confidence, both in the inventory and a lens into data, touch points, consumers, and that content and how that all comes together. Whether it's for retailers with strong e-commerce practices and customer engagements and, on our owned and operated, making sure we're setting up the right API access points for on-site media inventory and for ad buyers to have the right presence there at point of purchase with fewer touch points. There's a lot of opportunities, both in, owned and operated media, as well as, the performant layer of, programmatic and beyond in the offsite ecosystem. And honestly, we're just getting started through all of this and excited about how data is going to sit at the forefront to influence and drive change.
Thanks, Kara. And Ollie, this one's for you. More often than not, we're really seeing companies struggle to define the approach and the strategy. But what are some of the typical challenges that you see that both agencies and advertisers are struggling with? Like what's the most common conversation when you're having, just general conversations with clients?
Yeah, I mean, if you'd like a one-word answer, it's complexity. Brands are largely very willing and very keen to address this issue. We've had fantastic engagement with the Group M Coalition, but it's complex and it's difficult and potentially really labour intensive. So I think we're working in three areas: simplification as far as is possible. Whilst the framework we've published and the details of the value chain and the transparent calculation methodology, they're not a light read. When people have seen them, I think it has simplified the issue for them, and at least they know what we're talking about. So I think that is an important first step. I think the standardization is really important. The major platforms are never going to agree to every single data request from every single advertiser or brand. But what they might do, and what I think they will do, is if we can standardize that, they can actually publish that and they can start to automate the supply of that. So actually what could be very labor intensive becomes much more straightforward. And then lastly is kind of the automation, the leverage of technology, the technology that you've developed, some of the technology that Brian's developed, that actually make what could be a nightmare manual task in a time when we're really resource poor. Actually, it makes it much simpler, much faster. It can start to be integrated into our day-to-day operations. So I think those are the three kind of steps, all of which start to address that complexity issue, which I think really is the one big thing that's holding everyone back.
So this is for anyone, and Ollie, if you want to answer first, do you have any learnings so far or where you've been able to have some success?
Well, I'd just say get going, test and learn. Set those targets, understand what you're trying to do. I mean, Brian and Cara, you might want to talk a bit more about specific examples, but I would just say get going, because we know so much more now than we did a year ago, because we've got on with it, and you just have to dive in.
I'll add to that, Ollie. Last year we set these goals for Scope 3, and we were a baby company. I mean, we started at the very end of 2021. And so coming into last year, we had these goals like, have 50 articles written in the media, whether about us or not, that talked about sustainable advertising. I think we hit 50 in about 2 months. We get 10 brands to do a pilot with, sustainable data. And I think we had 30 in the second half last year alone of brands that actually did measurement, and many of those with DoubleVerify. And so you just see a sense of like just how much faster the industry's going than we thought. And so I think there's a lot of agencies and brands that have leaned in and have already taken these first steps. And so I think it's a lot less scary and a lot less confusing. Like we have a manual, we have, all of us can say, if you want to start, your team at DV knows what to do. Your team at Mindshare knows what to do. Your retail media partners at KPM know what to do. Like we can do this. And I think that's really important for everyone to understand. Like this is becoming more of a common practice, more of an everyday activity. Fully agree it needs to be simpler, more standardized, and more automated, but we're making a lot of progress toward that.
Yeah, I think the only build that I'd have, those are all phenomenal points. And if we think back on knowledge is power, data will be the great equalizer for evangelizing organizations to recognize the power of change and the power of progress. And so, Ollie, you're spot on with, just start to get after it. These lofty goals, when we can take the right steps at a time, we're going to make the right progress, but leverage the information around us, just like we're using data for, other signals and intelligence into, business planning processes. It should be no different in this space too. Great.
Thanks, Cara. So in terms of, this is really a question for everyone, and it's come in a variety of forms over the Q&A via the chats too, but how do you feel that sustainability fits into the broader picture and importance of media effectiveness? So balancing media quality, balancing attention, balancing sustainability. and also balancing price is incredibly important. So Ollie, I'll have you go ahead and start with this one. I think this is kind of the million, billion, trillion dollar question. So I would love to hear from everyone on this.
Yeah, well, just to be clear, sustainability is an and, not an or. And everyone has made that very clear to us. There's an expectation that we find a way to reduce emissions with no impact on performance, which is entirely reasonable. But I think the great thing is that we talk more broadly about responsible media, and there's a relationship between a lot of other factors in the media ecosystem and sustainability. So you buy more high attention, high quality websites, you need less impressions, and less impressions reduces emissions. A better quality consumer experience is often about a cleaner web experience with less tech on there and less ads showing, which equals lower emissions. Simplified programmatic supply chain, Brian mentioned that, means more money to publishers and lower emissions. So you are actually seeing all the other efforts to drive performance and clean up the digital ecosystem also happily kind of collide with the effort to reduce emissions. So I think, like I said, there are some quick wins, what I call plastic bag type behaviors, which add no value to the whole process and can easy to reduce. And there are going to be some challenges, which, as I said, is probably going to be more of a 2, 3, 4 year program across all channels to drive reduction, make sure that we have transparency on what people are doing, and make sure we're encouraging the right behaviors across the supply chain. But there are things that can be done immediately, and there are things that are going to take longer. But it is all in service of maintaining performance, but reduced emissions.
Yeah, those are great practical realities to navigate through. We at Kroger and Kroger Precision Marketing fundamentally believe the same. Effectiveness and sustainability, they go hand in hand. Wasted impressions, they've never been good for anybody. And that's partly why there's a big spotlight on retail media and the role that retail media can do to deliver performant nature of media impact. We just have one more reason now to cut wasted impressions from the system. So the good news, reducing wasted impressions is good for everyone, good for brands, good for shoppers, good for the planet. And to bring data numbers to life on this, when we have activated off our first party audiences relative to third party audiences, we've deployed 51% fewer impressions to deliver the same sales impact. And so Ollie's message there on, we can be more performant and we can reduce impressions. It's real, and it's around using the data signals in the right way. And of course, then we can connect the dots even further with a lot of the value that Brian's organization from Scope 3 is bringing forward, with more visibility and understanding down at the publisher level about what's happening on their carbon footprint. So again, great. It's a great spotlight, but in no way should effectiveness and sustainability be at odds. They absolutely coexist in really important ways.
Brian?
I don't think I could say it better. I would say, there's a lot of waste everywhere, especially in digital advertising. This is a brand new industry. It's only 25 years old at this point. And so I think a lot of these technologies that I and others came up with didn't really understand what those consequences would be. And because they grew so fast, there's a lot of things that just, like cars didn't have seat belts until the 1970s. Like that was 50 years after cars were invented and commonly used. So I feel like in some ways, like we're doing obvious, easy things. And we've done a lot of work recently at Scope 3 about data. And Carrie, your point is well taken. Like using the right data that is precise means that you don't have to buy a bunch of impressions. There's a lot of work being done around measurement and things like frequency across screens. Super important, because if you're dumping too many ads on somebody that aren't really impacting their behavior, that's waste, and we can pull back on those. And I think that all of these different, techniques, whether it's attention or it's looking at made for advertising inventory or buying from high quality first party data providers, all of these things make your marketing dollar go further, and they have a significant impact on the supply chain. And so I think that's really the next 2 or 3 years is not, the last few percent of how do we get rid of I don't know, like the emissions from office buildings. Like, that's not our goal. Our goal is let's get rid of the 50, 60, 70% of emissions from waste very, very quickly so that then we can focus our efforts on the harder, longer term issues.
Thanks, Brian. And I'm now going to Q&A from the audience. So this is probably for everyone. Ollie, you probably have the broadest perspective. Has there been any pushback or concern from major publishers for this initiative that get labeled as major polluters from the reporting on Scope 3? So again, like when you find in the reporting that there are major concerns,
Yep.
What are the discussions that either you, Brian, are having, or you, Ollie, are having directly as a result of some of the work that you're doing with Scope 3?
Yeah, so there's a lot of concerned faces, and rightly so. And most of the conversations are still happening in private. Brian alluded to an example where publishers were taken off a plan, but then they were provided with kind of triage actions that could address this, and actually could address it very, very quickly, and without any impact on advertising performance or actually their kind of commercial revenue. There will be some things that have an impact on their commercial revenue, and that'll be a choice they have to take. But I think a lot of these things have no benefit. They're just bad practice that has grown up over time. So there is concern, but we're not. To Brian's point, it's not you're off and there's no reason. You're off, this is the reason, and this is what can be done about it. So there's a lot of those conversations taking place. Longer term, these numbers will become more and more transparent, and that's important because we need to encourage the right behaviours across the marketplace. There's also been concern from different channels going, will I be seen to be kind of worse than other channels? And I think we say to them, that's actually not the purpose. We want to say, if we want to advertise in out of home, we're interested in who's made the most efforts in decarbonisation. If we want to advertise in print, we want to know who's made the most efforts in terms of decarbonisation, and that will be a factor in investment. So, we're making it clear that we want to work with people. The last point I'd make is we want a diverse supply chain, and there are smaller media companies who we think play a critical role in that. They are not so well resourced as some of the giant platforms. So for them, it's definitely about a 2-3 year roadmap. It's definitely about education and helping them understand what we do about this. So the threat of moving money sounds draconian, but the whole approach is actually very collaborative and very long term, and is as much about education as it is about dropping the hammer immediately.
Thanks, Ollie. And Brian, I think you already answered that question just a little bit earlier, and I want to make sure we get to as many questions as we can from the audience, and we've got a lot. So I'm going to give this one to you, Brian. AdNet Zero launched its US chapter just yesterday. A lot of attention in the rags about that. Got some immediate criticism from some of the activist groups. So could you just give some perspective and take on that?
Yeah, I think that we've seen a bunch of activity across almost every trade association in the industry in the past year, trying to figure out how to help the ecosystem decarbonize. And I think that AdNet Zero has a, big lofty mission of being the industry trade association for sustainability. I think the challenge is that right now there's not a clear roadmap to how AdNet Zero helps companies decarbonize. And it's not clear that there are criteria. Can anyone join AdNet Zero? Or is it only companies that are committed to decarbonization? How are they going to actually help with the process that all of us are talking about, and to do it really quickly? And so I think that's where they got pushback from from activists, from clean creatives, from others to say, well, what are you actually doing? My perspective is that all of us work for the planet, that we should support any organization, whether a trade association, a brand, a holding company, an ad tech company, a publisher, anybody who's committed to this journey, we should support. And we should hold ourselves and these organizations accountable. I think that accountability, I think that's one of your values, Julie, is accountability and doing the right thing. As long as we hold ourselves and each other accountable, we're going to get good outcomes. And I think it's actually valuable and important to hold organizations like AdNet0 accountable, because the more power they get, the more responsible they are for the outcomes that they drive.
That's a really good segue into another question from the audience, and keep them coming. We've got a lot of questions. We could stay on here for like 2 more hours, but we'll be done in 12 minutes. In terms of making this a standard for the industry, like viewability, and I would love for anyone to answer this. Kara, I would love your specific perspective on if Kroger is pushing this and how you might be pushing this. But do you see this sustainability measurement becoming a standard for the industry?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. What I love about this industry that is, 20, 25, 30 years young, Brian, you mentioned the date, is the rate of change and the influence into the future. And the fact of the matter is the KPIs of yesterday have to evolve. Like that just has to happen for us to improve. And so as we think about the role that retailers and retail media, entities can afford, we can't clearly do any of this alone. From a retail media standpoint, we're looking to reestablish and set new standards on the performant nature of media, the measurement standards. I can see this fall right in line with that as well. But it's going to take, to Brian's point, entities across the board coming together so we can align on the right measurement, the consistency for it, and how that then feeds into the day-to-day efforts, into both our planning and our buying practices. So the short answer is yes. And I love the industry for the evolution, the dynamic nature of change. It's so important. And if we're having the same conversation, even 2 years from now, we have done the planet a disservice.
Agree completely. Ollie, would love your perspective on this and what Group M is doing to try to push this.
Yeah, I mean, we've published our work. We published our work 9 months ago. We've made it available to anybody. And when we set out on the work, I naively believed that there was a perfect solution to this. And what you find out very quickly are there are so many rules, there are so many regulations that it really is open to interpretation, which increases the complexity. So we've published our interpretation of it. We've said to everyone, don't say no, but this is what we would do instead, or this is how we would like to approach it, because there are some brilliant minds out there that know a lot about this. And we're hoping that through that open dialogue, we will get to a standardized approach to this across the next 3 to 6 months. It's really important we do this. I think that open dialogue is critical. And we can go on our own, but we know our job will be much, much easier if there is standardization, and that standardization will benefit the whole market. So that's our ask, which is don't say no, but this is a better approach.
Thanks, Ollie. Another question from the audience, and Kara, I would like for you to start with this, and then probably Ollie. And then the next question, I will go to Brian. How should our campaign KPIs change as we buy greener from a programmatic perspective? What questions should we be asking both our partners and our agencies?
It's a great question. I'm going to actually go back to, I think, Ollie, you mentioned it out of the gates, that the performance expectation shouldn't change from a KPI standpoint. And the performant nature of media, the business impact of media should not go sideways. This is an additional KPI that can ride along to make sure that we're not just looking at the sales impact, the household penetration change, the unit movement happening off of advertising, but we're also recognizing the end-to-end carbon footprint of the media that's being deployed to move volume. So from a KPI standpoint on the performance side, organizations shouldn't expect anything worse. In fact, they should expect better performance because we're reducing these wasted impressions end to end. So hopefully, I know, Brian, you touched on that as well. So, Ollie, Brian, happy for you guys to maybe share other examples that you've seen as you've been working back with brands.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with this. It's just it's just an addition to your KPIs and a different lens on looking at performance. Um, uh, Scope 3 sent me 178,000 rows of data, impression level data, and half an hour later, I'd mapped it into poor performance, high performance, high emissions, low emissions, and put everything into quadrants. So you can start to see, if that's the lens you want to look at, you're saying, okay, what's poor performance and high emissions? They're off the plan. What's what's high performance and low emissions? Let's move the investment into there. And then the really interesting quadrant is high performance and high emissions. That's where you need to go through the triage process to identify the steps that they can make to lower emissions. So you have a lot of performance marketeers on here. There's some brilliant technology available to help you with this sort of analysis. So it's just looking at performance through an additional lens. And it needn't impact those other KPIs that currently exist.
And then we just add that most people aren't doing that in Excel.
Yep.
And that we integrated our data into board, not from a spreadsheet. And I think that's really important here. That's the automation point, is this gets built into more and more of the tools and processes. So this is just part of how everything, it sort of just works. Kind of like viewability, I think, is a good metaphor. Like, viewability was this crazy new data source, and now it's just something we all use every single day.
I'm not recommending the spreadsheet. I'd hasten to add, it was fun 6 months ago, but not so much on a daily basis.
Brian, one more question for you, and then we're going to start wrapping up. And I think it builds on the last answer that you had. But what position is being taken on the use of avoided emission carbon credits and carbon removal credits? So what is the perception on offsetting versus reducing?
Well, I'll say first that there's a huge reduction opportunity here. I mean, there's so much waste. Kara talked about it in context of first-party data. We see it in the programmatic supply chain. We see it around made-for-advertising inventory and attention. There's just so many low-hanging fruit. And every time you don't buy an impression, that takes money out of the supply chain. But more importantly, it takes carbon out. If you look at the billions and billions of dollars that ad tech companies invest every year in cloud and data center, you can just see the huge amount of electricity that's being used to serve all these worthless ads. So that has to be our first priority. If you're down to the very bare bones and you say, hey, I know I have some impact on the environment and I'd like to do something to address it, there's very high quality ways that you can do that. You could put solar panels on your buildings. You could do a direct purchase of wind or other power, but even that, anything natural is going to be very different during windy days, not windy days, day, night. Like, we have to account for all of those things for the actual impact they have on our electricity use and our emissions. And so all those offsets that you're talking about are kind of an accounting trick. I don't think that's the way that we can have the most impact on the environment. And I think that were we to decide that some of that offsetting or accounting needs to be done, I do feel like that should be done at the very end of the supply chain, not all through the middle. I think it's too complicated to understand who's doing what. So if you are going to do carbon removal, do it with the highest quality, high price, legitimate partners that know how to actually get real carbon out of the environment. If you're paying less than about $100 a metric ton, you're probably not getting real removal from happening. And you're looking at 100-year removal, permanent removal. Very few companies offer that kind of permanent removal. There's not much supply of it. And so I would just in general say, maybe in a few years, we can invest there and we can make arguments about how market interest will drive new investment. And there's all kinds of economists that talk about this. I just think that's not the way we have the most impact. I think we focus on waste, we focus on reduction, huge and rapid impact.
Thanks, Brian. All right, the final question for each of you. What do you think is the most important globally applicable recommendations for advertisers to take away from what we've talked about today? So kind of a quick answer here. And Ali, I will start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go broader, because there's an excellent question in the Q&A about the broader impact of advertising. Sustainability has been positioned as a purpose issue, which is fantastic if you believe in it. But I think we just need to start viewing it as an economic issue, because I think that's what will drive progress much faster. We should be looking, whether it's in media or the impact of advertising, as sustainability is the biggest consumer opportunity of the next 20 years. There is a 40% gap between intent and action in the sustainability area. Brands and businesses that deliver products and services that meet that need will absolutely thrive. It's a uniquely unifying issue across all geographies, across all ages. And I think, if the last 20 years was digital transformation, I do think the next 20 years will be about sustainable transformation, and people should be leaning into this and viewing it as a huge opportunity for their businesses.
Kara, your advice?
I think it's pretty clear for folks that have been in this industry for, whether you've been here for a couple of years or a couple decades, the legacy digital ad ecosystem is unsustainable on several levels. And there's been a hidden cost to focusing these past 25 years on untargeted digital ads, efficient reach. At the end of the day, it's really important for advertisers to understand intentionally where their business is today. Use the data to inform your tomorrow. There are new ways that are coming forward to enable each of your investment teams and your agency partners. I love agencies leaning in on this holistically, given the sheer scale and volume and influence that they have, both on the planning and the investment side. So work with your agency partners, work with Brian and his team, work with key leaders that are going to drive change, but know your numbers and put a plan together for your own progress. And again, you will be on the road to progress, and that will help all of us around around this ecosystem. Publishers, agencies, brands, ad tech companies, we all will improve by everybody getting on the road.
Thanks, Brian.
I've been out evangelizing this for 18 months, and I've never met someone who was not an environmentalist. I've never met someone who said, I don't like the environment and I really want to hurt it every day with what I do. So what this means is that every colleague, every person you work with cares. And so our job is to be advocates. Our job is to take action, and our job is to do it now. And I think that we've laid out a bunch of good frameworks here. This is possible. This is good for business. This is an economic issue and a moral issue. And I think if we take real steps now, in 2023, we will reap the benefits professionally, personally, commercially, and environmentally by 2030.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So to wrap it up, I think the easiest way to look at this is a crawl, walk, run framework. I see this all the time, super easy to understand. I think a lot of folks are probably at the crawl phase. Start measuring and understand the basics. Explore the data, accumulate the data, start identifying trends and patterns. Walk, combine data and understand the bigger picture. Combine and match Scope 3 data with your media quality data and your campaign KPIs. And then please, please, please start running for the good of all of us. I think everybody has said this. This is something that we all should be all in on. Take actions, leverage the insights for data-driven, carbon-aware decisions and actions across your media strategy. The topic of sustainability has become critical to each and every one of us. I am the mother of 5 children. I am a grandmother. One of the reasons why I have this job is because I want to make this world better for all of us. Let's really work together to continue to build our mutual businesses, but in a way that's really going to protect the future for each one of us and our families. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. There were a lot of questions in the Q&A, so we will be following up on those afterwards with some of the follow-ups that we have. And if the panelists are willing to come back again, I'm sure this is going to be an ongoing topic. I think this is something that we could do every 6 months and have a really meaningful conversation. So again, panelists, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.